Bring this meeting to order. Okay, at 4:35, Friday, the August 2nd. Okay. And Mr. Gilberto, you can, just do your thing.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, through you, just for the record, the meeting is being recorded and broadcast by both Zoom and NORCAM technology for anyone who is participating. Meeting was called in order to provide the Select Board an opportunity to discuss potentially submitting one or more debt exclusion questions to the State Secretary of the Commonwealth for inclusion on the state November 5th biennial election ballot. So I think everybody's familiar. We have an annual town election here in town in May. We also have the ability to request a debt exclusion or other Proposition 2.5 related question be placed on the state ballot. The advantage is we don't have to run a separate election. It's on the same paper ballot that's given to folks on November 5th, run through the machine. Significant operational financial savings by doing that. And the specific projects in question are the projects that were discussed as being funded over the multi-year period proposed for the Proposition 2.5 override that was voted on at town meeting and at the special election in June. Certainly don't like being in the situation of having to have this discussion at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon in the summer. I'm sure everyone feels that way. But the timing of such with where the board's regular meetings fell, where the financial planning team meetings fell as well, and then our ability to get advice from the from the appropriate folks kind of led us to this point in time to get word one way or the other to the state secretary's office by this Wednesday, which is the statutory deadline. For purposes of the discussion, there were 3 items that were discussed as part of the override, potentially having their debt service, so the cost of repaying the borrowing for those projects, being funded as part of the override, again, being phased in over a multi-year period. Those 3 projects were the Chestnut Street Bridge, the Burroughs Road Bridge, and then the fire department's ladder truck. 2 of those projects are on a very compressed timeline. I think we're all familiar with Chestnut Street and the challenges of that road being closed. We have been progressing through an aggressive permitting process, both environmental and State Department of Transportation permitting over the past 8 months. And we are on the verge of receiving approval for the design that was reviewed by the Select Board back in August. Certainly want to recognize our legislative delegation for getting the Article 97 legislation approved earlier this year. So that project is expected to be ready to be funded at this October's fall annual town meeting. The cost is roughly $4 to $4.5 million with a significant likely borrowing cost that financial planning team has proposed to the Select Board be funded outside of the existing tax levy via Proposition 2.5 debt exclusion. The second project that we talked about was the Burroughs Road Bridge. That project is on a timeline that's about a year behind the Chestnut Street timeline. We are in a preliminary permitting process for that project with the state. We are still optimistic that we will be able to make a what I'll call a medium-term repair in the form of replacing the existing culverts and not having to go through a full bridge reconstruction. We do have an appropriation in place from, I believe, the fall of last year that would fund that replacement, should it be approved. Should it not be approved, then we would need to go through the much more extensive design process that we were required to follow for the Chestnut Street Bridge, which would likely involve a more expensive project that would require funding outside of the existing tax levy, but would not, the cost of which and the exact design of which would not be known in time for the fall annual town meeting this year. So again, that's one of the things that was proposed to be phased in. So we're committed to that project and committed to proceeding as quickly as we can with that project. But it's not at a planning point where if a full reconstruction is required, that we would be responsibly be able to ask for a construction appropriation at fall town meeting. So in the draft of the communication to the secretary's office, I actually don't have that question on there. And the reason is pretty simple. You have to have a good idea of what the cost is going to be in order to proceed with a direct debt exclusion question. And we just don't have that information right now. The third project was the fire department ladder truck. That's roughly, Lorianne, $1.9 million project that was proposed for borrowing debt service to be repaid under the override, which of course was not approved, but for which we are now proposing a debt exclusion funding. That's apparatus that will take multiple years to be designed and built before being delivered. And I've spoken with the fire chief, and we will be, as indicated earlier this year, requesting funding at the October town meeting. And due to the amount, don't foresee an ability to repay the bond within the existing tax levy. For all three of the projects, we could repay the bond within the levy, but not without significant capital or operating budget impacts over the next few years. The final thing that I'll offer is that, as was provided in the packet, we do have debt service, excluded debt service. So debt service that's above and beyond Proposition 2.5 limits that will be coming fully paid off, and that will ease some of the pressure on the taxpayer with regard to capital projects, at least. Looking at the numbers, ballpark, I think it ended up being about $120 decrease in debt service to the average single family home. For the two projects that we're proposing to the board for debt exclusion, the fire ladder truck and Chestnut Street Bridge, those equal, I think, Lorianne, it's about $80 total per year for the average single family taxpayer over the life of the
about
road.
90.
$90, okay.
Yeah.
So we're not here to certainly compel anybody to seek a debt exclusion. We're more here to provide you an opportunity should you be interested in pursuing that, because we do have the opportunity to tag on to the ballot for the state biennial election. To be clear with regard to our debt service, we know we're in a closeout process with the state regarding our middle and high school construction project. At some point, there will be long-term borrowing that will have an impact on the taxpayer. The amount of that is just not determined at this point in time, and that's certainly something we'll have to discuss, including whether we want to try to pay down some of that debt at that point in time. So just, trying to present everything that's in play. And then, finally, to be clear, we certainly do have the ability to fund the two projects that I brought up for discussion here, using available funds in the form of our Pulte sale of town-owned land proceeds. That would be a valid use. It would be roughly $6.5 million out of the $15+ million that remains. I think the only reason we're not here recommending that as a first option is because of the extensive interest that it's providing us and how important that interest will be as we've cut budgets this year to closer margins than we've had to in previous years, and are concerned that there could be reduced free cash. So I know that was probably a long introduction, but I was trying to kind of provide everybody everything and let the public get the benefit of hearing this information as well. Mr. Chairman, through you, I do want to ask if the finance director has anything that she would like to add for the board to consider before we have discussion.
I don't have anything to add unless anyone had any specific questions about what was provided.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and before I open it up, so on the average home of we're using 890,000. What's the valuation?
It's
811.
811, 899 is the amount.
All right, so on 811, 899, so the average, it would be $90 over how many years? Addition.
The Chestnut and the ladder truck go out through 2046.
And it'd be $90, you said?
Yeah, it declines. So by the last year, it's about $50.
Okay, but, okay, so the average 8, all right, and then do we have an actual like tax rate so people can calculate it on their own properties based on their real value, not the average?
What was provided in the packet, there is a tax rate impact per $1,000 evaluation, like for each year. So on the Chestnut Street Bridge, it's 8 cents per thousand in 2027, which is the heaviest year. And then the ladder truck is 4 cents per thousand.
So 12 cents per thousand.
Yep.
Okay. All right, thank you. All right, I'm just gonna go across, well, Mr. O'Leary, there in the corner, you can go first.
Sure, just to bring my colleagues up to up to date. Again, we had a financial planning team meeting, which the chair wasn't able to attend. And the discussion that took place, there was unanimity amongst the members of the financial planning team at the time to move forward with the plan which we had laid out prior to the Springtown meeting, the override vote, and all the rest, that if the override had failed, at the ballot, which it did, that we had told the public that these specific projects, we would be coming back at some later date, but soon, for the Chestnut Street Bridge and the ladder truck and potentially Burrows Road, depending upon how that worked out. So there was unanimity that, we should follow through with what we told the public we were going to do, and that was to seek a debt exclusion vote on those specific projects because of the impact that they would have on the general operating budget moving forward based upon the failed override vote. So regardless of the where anybody stands on the issues itself, it was important that we felt that it was important that we follow through and deliver what we said we were going to do to the public if the override failed. So that's first and foremost. Also, additionally, in the discussion, there was other, it went a little bit further in relation to whether we should be including other debt service for other projects, specifically the vocational school for an override exclusion. I think that's a discussion for another day. As far as the timing of this, it was also pointed out that there would be some savings and economies of scales of particularly with the Chestnut Street project and the fire truck, that the timing of it is very good. As far as we were going to go to October town meeting anyway for the funding. And if we were going to go for a debt exclusion vote, if the board determined to go for a debt exclusion vote on those two items, we would have to incur the cost for an additional special election where we can piggyback on the state election. We thought that would make significant amount of sense. And that's why we're meeting tonight, to just make that determination. So, if we're going to move forward and provide the general public, the populace, an opportunity to determine whether or not they want to exclude the Chestnut Street Bridge and the fire truck or through a debt exclusion, then we should do that at town meeting and do it through the state election rather than having a special election. Just save some money there and let the public decide. So that's where we stand in relation to that. From a personal standpoint, the timing makes sense to me. That we're going to be going to October town meeting anyway. Why would we have a special election and pay for those costs and incur the additional turmoil in the clerk's office to try and run an additional special election outside of two other elections which are taking place, one in September, one in November anyway. So to me, I think the public is going to have an opportunity, should have an opportunity to decide whether or not they want this to be a debt exclusion or not. And I think the timing of it is actually fortuitous for us, where we can actually piggyback on the state election. So I, for one, am in favor of putting forth the two questions for public's consideration and requesting the Secretary of State to include it on the state ballot. We can discuss the merits of the arguments as to whether we should be doing it or not doing it later on, but our backs are against the wall as far as the timing on this one. We have to notify the Secretary of State's office, so I think we should avail ourselves of the opportunity, and we can discuss the merits when it comes time to including warrant articles for the October town meeting, and whether we're in support or not support of the debt exclusion. But ultimately, town meeting and the voters will decide if we provide them that opportunity, and I think it's incumbent upon us to do that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Ms. Gonzalez?
Yeah, this is no surprise. You know, as Mr. O'Leary said, we discussed this at information meetings. We discussed this all along that if the Prop 2.5 failed, we would need to come back and ask for these debt exclusions. So to be able to piggyback on the state election and save money, I think is a great idea. So I'm in favor.
Mr. Massey?
I'm not sure not sure the general concern is really about the state election versus a special election. I certainly get the point, and it's fiscally responsible to do so, to get on the November ballot. I think a bigger concern that we're gonna have to face is where we're pulling this money from. You know, if we got money in the bank, if we have ARPA funds, if we have Pulte funds, if we need to do Chestnut Bridge now, that's a major question. I actually think Burroughs is in a lot worse shape. Now, the cost from a town perspective, from the cost of a bridge compared to, you know, worst case that happens of a liability to the town. Now that's an easy sell, because we, you know, whatever Pulte funds are less, that's one lawsuit. So I get the understanding of the September ballot, but I'm not so sure, you know, I'm not so sure the Chestnut Bridge is a necessity right now. I do think Burroughs Road should be more prioritized, certainly from looking at the engineer reports. The fire truck is another tough one. You know, I was grasping with this. I came up with the idea of potentially, you know, if there's a fire station project that goes through, is there a potential where we can add that ladder truck to that project? Make it very clear to the residents that 2 million of whatever that cost may be is for a new fire truck. Don't get nervous about the price tag. This is what's included in it. The other thing is the interest versus interest. The interest to pay for this loan compared to the interest that we're making off of the Pulte funds. I certainly understand that the Pulte funds are our biggest free cash generator, and that's very important to the town. I understand that. You know, I wonder if we prioritize and say, all right, let's just go forward with one of the bridges or one of the culverts. And by the way, I've seen full building culverts. I can stand in the culvert. So, you know, to see, you know, we have to go with a bridge, I'm not so sure. Yeah, but for me, especially after the no override, I think the residents spoke very clearly. And Mr. O'Leary, to your point, Mrs. Gonzalez, I understand that we did promise the residents. I am an understanding of that. But personally, I'm not against this. And I think as a group, you know, certainly I would love to be able to get together with our board and, you know, whoever else may want to join about. This is a tough position, you know. If it's a $2 or $3 million project and we need to go out for a debt exclusion, it shows a lot about the position that we're in as a town. And I think that opens us up to wrap our brains around to see how else can we really generate revenue. And when we have to think outside the box. But to me, at this point, with these two projects, the fire ladder truck and the Chestnut Street Bridge, because I see Burroughs got taken out, to me, I am not in favor.
Wallner?
Okay, so I'll deal with the priorities first. I drive over Burroughs Bridge every day, but I can't drive over Chestnut Street. And so the priority of bridges has to be Chestnut because it's closed up. It's affecting our traffic, it's affecting Moynihan's. So to me, the Chestnut Street is clearly the bridge that needs to be taken care of right away because it's closed. And Burroughs, maybe it's gonna fall apart, but nobody shut it down, and I think if the state was concerned, they would have shut it down. So, and then on the ladder truck, it is years for that to be created, and they need it. So I think the priorities of Chestnut Street and the ladder truck are very appropriate. Burroughs, we don't even have an estimate on that yet, so I don't think that should be being thought about right now. And closing the school, I don't even know anything about that. So I think the priorities are very clear. And I think that I'm encouraged to hear that we have old debt that's coming off of the tax burden that would be replaced by the new debt. So from a homeowner's point of view, it'll just be about a wash if we fund these two things. So they really won't see an increase, because at the same time there's going to be a decrease because some old debt is coming off the books. So I think it's actually, they're gonna, even with the new debt, they'll even be just a tad bit lower than they are right now. But basically, let's just call it a wash. So there is no extra burden on the taxpayers. And the third thing is in the Pulte money, let's just be very clear about how much that's pulling in. There's a little over $15 million, and it's pulling in currently around $700,000 worth of interest, which does, as Nick had mentioned, goes right to free cash. And as we know, without the Prop 2.5, our free cash is now going to be under duress. So while interest rates are high, and considering that taking on this new debt for these two priority projects is a wash, I think it's very responsible to hold on to the Pulte money for interest while interest rates last, because we know we have other projects coming up. The Burroughs Bridge, closing of the school books, and of course the fire station. Something has to happen there. And we're gonna need money for that, and maybe that's where we're gonna pull that from, this Pulte. So I'm in favor of the getting this, moving forward on the motions that we have forward for the reasons I just listed. Thank you.
So let me start by saying one way or the other, whether cash, gift from the state, bonding, I think it needs to get done. If you scour, and not that we have to pay too much attention, but if you scour social media, I will guarantee you there are more complaints about Chestnuts being closed than anything else across the board. Just and that is the most that people have told me, more because, again, the fields of McGuire, Moynihan, all these things, the cut through, anyone who lives on Central Street, both sides. So meaning it, because it's like one of those things where today I was driving back from the Cape and a motorcycle accident on 93 North in Somerville backed up to Route 3. So one thing backs thing, and I know it's not the same, but I'm just trying to give an analogy that there's a reason, since Chestnut closed, that when you hook a right after Heavenly, it takes 20 minutes to get to Nan's. That's a long time. So I think and Mr. Massey, you mentioned a question about, what we would pay versus what we're getting in interest, kind of the spread. And again, it's not exact, but right now, a 20-year muni bond based on, and I'm looking at my trading screen, so this is real-time data, a 20-year muni bond at our credit rating, you're probably paying about 3.6% to borrow on average. And again, that could change, versus I think that even though Treasury yields have tumbled the last week, CD rates for a year, you can probably still push close to 5 if you really need to. So again, that's the spread right now, about 1.4 roughly. And again, by the way, Mr. Massey, that could change real time. I'm just trying to answer your question the best I can. I think that the fire truck is a public safety thing. And I know in the community, CIPC, has been trying to figure out a way to include this in one of the budgets. And I also think that it's, as I've said before, when it comes to the Pulte funds, forget about not using it here or there. I mean, there's a lot of bridges and culverts, I guess, that have not been looked at for, 5 decades. So I can tell you that Burroughs is not the last one and Chestnut's not the last one. But it just becomes one of those things where we got to play whack-a-mole and make sure that the state is not closing us down left and right to the point where we have, Haverhill and Main Street is the only ways in 62 to get anywhere. I do want to give it to the voters and to decide, and again, I'm a numbers guy, but with that debt coming off, the net effect on, again, the average would be about $30 savings, meaning technically that instead of the 120 savings for what Mrs. Galvin said, we would only get a $30 savings, but now at the same time, though, we have a ladder truck, and this is assuming the vote goes through, of course. We'd have a ladder truck, but more importantly, we would open up Chestnut Street. And the way I see it is that it's something where there is a lot of things, not just in this town, but there's a lot of things that need to be fixed. So to me, if we're saving to the left a little bit and then picking up on the right because we have to do things, I think that's an opportunity where at the very least, it's kind of like if you're, a set it and forget it on your 401k. I know it's not a one-to-one analogy, but it's like, hey, it's not going to affect you, meaning negatively. It's just you're not going to see as much savings from this other debt coming off. And I understand that. And also I always ask for the averages because I think it is important that the average gets talked about, because I feel that sometimes, up or down, right? I've had discussions where somebody was like, wow, my property's only worth X. I mean, like percentage wise, that sounds really high, right? Because they're only looking at the top line number. So that's why I asked Mrs. Galvin to break it down. So, because that's another question when we were especially talking about sewer. Okay, I know I said the bad word, but when we were talking about it, the question was always, well, what does it mean for me personally, right? Based on my house value, not the average. So I am inclined to allow, as we stated in a lot of board meetings, to allow the public to decide. And I do think that, especially with Chestnut Street and the fire truck being public safety, I do think that, I mean, I'm inclined to believe, based on what I heard again, that this is something the public would support. Now, counter argument, I'll make it. We have this money, right? The way I see it, though, is that here's what I tell clients. Let's say you can finance something because you're playing interest rate arbitrage because you're getting more, right, than what you're going to pay if you pay cash. We can always pay down the debt. Okay, we always have that. That's what I tell clients. If you can get a good rate on a car and then and then you just don't want to pay it anymore because, you're not making as much in your investments as you feel, we can always pay that down. So I just feel like it gives us the max options, allows us to take advantage, which I think at most will be another year of competitive interest rates at most, and then kind of just take it from there. And then if it fails, just like after the override didn't go through, we'll do the best we can. Like Mr. Massey said, we'll have a discussion again and just say, hey, maybe we're forced to use some semblance of savings or free cash. Although, again, another downside of that is we've talked about ad nauseum is that credit rating agencies do not look kindly when your savings account is getting dangerously low.
Mhm.
And then it becomes something where, let's say we have this fire station in the future, which is a big project, which we definitely have to finance. That's where I'm thinking that it would be a better use of a big chunk of money. Let's say that after the revisions, and I'm spitballing numbers, I don't know any of the numbers, but let's say it comes in that it's 30 million. I'm just throwing a number. If you can throw 10 or 15 towards there, especially if rates have tumbled, I feel like it's, for me anyways, from a financial standpoint, it makes more sense. So, but I'm inclined to allow for it to be on the ballot. And then, again, it's like nothing's free in life, right? Because the state's paying through taxes, but at least it's not another check we got to cut. So Mrs. Gonzalez?
Could we go into detail about why we are not putting Burrows Road on the ballot? Getting a lot of feedback from the public asking why Burrows Road is not
Mr.
being a
Chairman,
priority.
Mr. Chairman, through you.
Yep.
We are, again, in a state or state required permitting process for that bridge. We have an appropriation from last October in the amount of roughly $600,000 that we continue to be hopeful that we can use to replace the culverts and address the issues at that location, which is a much less expensive option than a total reconstruction of that bridge. If we get that approval, we may be able to proceed without any further appropriation of funding using what we have here. That's not a guarantee, but that was sort of our intention when we came up with that request last October. So we would go to the engineers, we'd do the design work, we would, go through the procurement process and replace the pipes to deal with this issue, repave the road and move on from it. If we are not allowed to do that by the state, we will be required to go through environmental survey. We will be required to go through a design review, both with the Department of Transportation and with the state environmental permitting authorities. They'll need to provide comment. We'll then need to do a final design and a cost estimate, all of which takes time and is required to inform us of how much the project is likely to cost. When we were talking about the override, we were planning for what we thought would be the worst case scenario, which was that it cost as much as Chestnut Street may cost, so $4 to $4.5 million. But we were talking about phasing in components of that override, so we knew that we didn't have a certain number at that point in time. So for us to get to the October town meeting, it would be very, premature to be able to ask for an appropriation of funds, not knowing what the final design is, that it's been approved by the state, and that we have a valid cost estimate. The other thing that is a bit more complicated is, when you create a debt exclusion question, it is specific to the project that you're talking about. And while it doesn't need to match exactly, you need to have a rough estimate of what the cost is. So, engineering feedback cost estimates, which we have for Chestnut Street Bridge, they allow some wiggle room for inflation or related cost increases. But in this case, we just don't know that estimate. We believe me, the DPW, the directors here, the town engineers here, fire chief, if he were here, the police chief as well, we are all very concerned about Burrows Road. I don't want that to be lost in this conversation. It is not in a condition where it's been required to be closed by the state. And we are working to try to prevent that from becoming the case, as ended up happening with Chestnut Street. We're continuing to push for that replace in kind with new culverts with new technology that will withstand the impact that the water has and the impact of traffic. We're hopeful that that will be the case. And if it's not, we will be back here, as soon as we can with a request for funding for a bridge reconstruction.
Thank you very much.
Does that answer your question, Mrs. Gonzalez?
Well, it wasn't my question.
Well, no. I mean, does
Several
that
other
answer? Did you get the,
Yes, I think that was a really good response, and I appreciate that.
Okay. Anyone else? Anything else? Mr. Massey?
Mr. Chair, one question. The fire truck, do you know the lead time on that? I'm just thinking, how are we gonna fit that fire truck in the current building?
It's a two to 3 year lead time between design and the multiple vendors that get involved in constructing it. There'll be a committee of firefighters that will be involved in the design to fit the apparatus in the station. If we don't end up building the apparatus to fit the station, the other option is the reallocation of existing apparatus, so into different spots within the station. But I expect the chief and the firefighters involved will be working under the assumption that it needs to fit at the station on Park Street. And there was a related question that came into the chat just to address it. This is replacing an existing fire ladder truck that has, that is aging out, that we are required under NFPA to replace. It's not because of any sort of new development that's occurred. We're replacing an existing piece of apparatus.
And thank you, Mr. Gilbert. I appreciate that. The other question, or the point I want to make with the Chestnut Street Bridge versus the boroughs, Mr. Wallner mentioned he drives over that every day. Well, worst comes to worst. If that bridge fails, how are you getting home? Now, the fact of Chestnut, now that's a bigger, chaotic and bigger issue for the town than Chestnut Street, where the fire department's actually coming from there. I'm sorry, Mr. Wallner, I'm finishing. The fire truck actually comes from the other side of town to be able to get down to Moynihan Lumber or the DPW. But the residents, I think, are the only ones really getting inconvenienced by the Chestnut. Boroughs would be a major issue if that bridge failed. The town, we can talk about a few million, 4 or 5 million. That would cost an exorbitant amount of money to be able to build something temporarily under an emergency contract to be able to get everyone to be able to get to their home. Chestnut, I just think there are other ways around. You can still access Chestnut. Yeah, it might take another 120 seconds to get there, but boroughs, if that thing fails, you're screwed.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah,
I think,
oh.
In terms of, I'm sorry, did I?
Mr. Wallner?
Yeah, we already, that neighborhood has been flooded out in the past. We have a rear entrance to the highway to get out. So while it'd be an inconvenience, we're not shut off. So it wouldn't be like you'd have to fix the Burroughs Bridge. I mean, it'd be really inconvenient, but we have access to the highway in the back. And that's happened to us with floods before where we couldn't get through the bridge.
Have you had the opportunity to read the engineer reports to see the different condition between the bridges and the difference between them? What are your thoughts on that?
All I know is Chestnut shut down and Burroughs is not. So far the state hasn't made us shut down Burroughs. They've made us shut down Chestnut.
Mr. Gilberto, go ahead.
I don't by any means you can't understate what is being said though, in terms of the impact. I want to be clear. There's no disagreement from anyone in the DPW, fire, police. While there is secondary access, there would be a dramatic impact on that neighborhood. There would be a potential impact on response time that we would need to look at in terms of whether we need to pre-position apparatus. There would be a whole response plan we would have to put in place. I cannot understate that impact. And I also cannot understate that if the DPW director, that town engineer, and I could have had our way, we would have dug the pipes up and replaced them nearly a year ago, because we know that's what needs to be done. And the pure reality is, because of the required permitting, we cannot. So the things that we've heard happen in other places, like on Interstate 95 in Connecticut, where the regulatory wand is waved and we're able to do a project, those places are able to do a reconstruction project very quickly. We've not been the beneficiary of that. We will continue to advocate for that so that we can avoid a situation of what would be a disorderly shutdown of a main feeder to a neighborhood. But we are working to try to avoid that. But this is not about whether, for us, the reasons it's not on that listing are not because it's not a priority, not because we aren't very concerned, and not because we don't want to do the project. It's purely because we are simply not able to at this point in time. But we'll continue to proceed. And if something changes between now and October town meeting, for example, the community will have the opportunity to consider an appropriation from whatever available funds it would like. And that's something that just kind of bleeds into a comment I want to offer, which is, there's a lot of conversation we can have about the Pulte funding and how to pay for these projects. Fortunately, October town meeting will be a place where we can have that conversation. And because of the nature of these debt exclusion questions, should, for example, town meeting opt to use some other source of available funds to fund either of these projects, a debt exclusion question would still be on the ballot. But there would it's likely that borrowing would not be in place, and therefore the tax implication really can't come to fruition.
Mhm.
So, the conversation and the interesting, and the interest that the community has and the voice the community should have on these projects, that will all get to be heard at October town meeting. If we're not in a position where we're able to recommend a further appropriation for Burrows Road, obviously that may not be on the warrant, but I'm sure we'll hear about that at town meeting as well. But again, I don't want to alarm the community, but I do want folks to know we are very concerned about Burrows Road, and we are committed to moving as quickly as we can to seek authorization for as quick and safe a repair as we can make.
Thank you, Mr. Gilbert. Mr. Gilbert, one last question. The ARPA funds outside of Pulte, the ARPA funds those need to be committed by the end of the year. What would be our plan to utilize, where would we utilize the remaining funds by the end of the year? Can we use those in either of these by any chance?
So we talk about remaining funds, and the finance director can sort of check me on the numbers. We're looking at about $500,000 that was allocated for wastewater that has not been reallocated for any other purpose. I think we have, is it a $400,000 for the town center wastewater, Lorianne? Do I have that number right?
Remaining,
No, authorized. Or was it less? For town center wastewater.
1.6.
Oh, it was a bigger number. I'm sorry. That might.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
Go on, hold on to it.
1.6, 1.8, something like that, 1.6.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah,
so our
Mr.
plan is
Gilberto, Mr. Gilberto, didn't we, and correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't we end up not, I know there's some things we had to close out, but it was gonna be some ARPA that we didn't end up using
That's
on
correct.
the wastewater project.
That's what we're
Well-
talking about. Yes.
yes,
So that's the current, okay, you're not talking town,
Yeah, for the larger wastewater project, yes, there's $500,000 that is unspent and unobligated. We need to have it obligated by December 31st. Absent any other, change, as I've indicated previously, that funding doesn't go away. The finance director has the ability to allocate it on our state tax recapitulation sheet, where it becomes free cash available to the town to be authorized through an appropriation at town meeting. Neither of those sources are enough to totally pay for the bridge project that we're talking about. Should the board want to have a future discussion about using those funds to maybe defray the cost that gets passed along in the debt exclusion, you certainly could do that. And likewise, we will continue to be looking for state grant funding, which we wouldn't have an award until well after a debt exclusion, but that may also defray the cost. The one thing that I will note is the major funding source for the bridge is likely to be the municipal vulnerability program, or MVP program, the state has set up. I know that the town has had quite a bit of conversation, but a community that is not compliant with the 3A zoning, MBTA zoning, is not eligible for that funding. So I do feel the obligation just to disclose that. But those are all things that would reduce what gets passed along to the taxpayer once we know whether we received an award or not. And those are, in the case of ARPA, you could schedule a separate discussion if that's what you so wish to do regarding the funds that could be used to defray the cost. But I would encourage you not to make that commitment here, since it wasn't on the agenda. And
no, we're definitely not gonna have that commitment here,
Yeah.
but maybe just,
Thank you, Mr. Gilbert.
Mrs. Galvin, if maybe before our August 19th meeting, I'm not saying we're sure to talk about it because there's other things, but if we could have kind of a general sense of what's left over that could be recommitted.
the main thing to keep in mind is either of those projects, they would have to be a contract in place by December of 24. So it doesn't sound like, well, maybe Chestnut, but the ladder truck,
probably not.
that will take a while to design before they even go out to bid. So that's the caveat. It's December of 24, actual, not just plan to spend or how you plan to spend it. You actually have to have a contract.
Okay. Okay. Anything else from my fellow board members?
Yep, Mr. Chairman,
Mr. O'Leary?
I kept my comments at the beginning less specific, but we're getting into more specifics here. And again, to me, this evening was to decide whether or not we're going to put forth the questions for the public to consider on the November ballot. And as far as as the town administrator pointed out, and as I mentioned earlier, the nuances as to whether we're in favor, opposed, or how the machinations are going to go will be hashed out through the October town meeting warrant and articles there. But for the most part, what we're talking about here, what the public is going to be looking for us to explain to them is a cash flow issue. Cash flow issue from a town standpoint and cash flow issue from the household standpoint, the taxpayers' households, how much can they afford? So we have all this information that Mrs. Galvin had provided to us in relation to debt service that's falling off, basically $120 for the average household, in a year or so. And then these two projects would add about 90. So the net gain to the household from a cash flow standpoint would be $30 savings if they decided to support an override for these two projects. So we can get into all of that in October, and I am a firm believer that the October town meeting should have the opportunity to determine, how we're going to pay for these projects, whether it's going to be through a debt exclusion or through, in particular, the Chestnut Street Bridge, because that's the one that's closest to coming to fruition and needs to be fixed. But we're closest to getting it fixed now. Or whether they want to use Pulte money, or whether they want us to, decide whether or not to close Chestnut Street permanently. Don't even bother. I mean, if that's what's being suggested by not fixing the Chestnut Street Bridge, then let's say it and let's discuss it and make a determination that no further appropriation is going to be made, because we need $4 million to fix the bridge, plain and simple. So where do we get it?
Okay.
But again, all that can be decided in short order by the October town meeting. But it's a cash flow issue for the taxpayers and every household. It's a tax flow issue for our financing here and how we manage our debt, managing the town's debt for the municipality. So all that's going to get hashed out in October. But I think it's important right now that we just focus on, do we want to put this forth for the voters to decide, yes or no, on a debt exclusion on the November ballot to save ourselves money of a special election. And again, it requires a 2/3 vote of our board. So it takes 4 out of 5 members here to put it forward to the Secretary of State's office to have it included. So that's what we have to decide. Are we going to put it forth and follow through with what we said we were going to do or not? And are we going to try and do it in a fashion which an opportunity presents itself to save ourselves some money and not have a special election?
Okay.
To me, that's pretty simple.
Okay. Anyone else? Anything else?
No, Mr. Chair, through you, sorry, Mr. O'Leary, quick question. That was actually the first time I've ever heard that. I never knew that. All debt exclusions require a 4 out of 5 select board vote.
2/3 vote, but 2/3 of a 5-person borough board is 4.
Yeah.
And that's different than a general operating override, which would be majority vote or 3 votes.
Thank you, Mr. O'Leary. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. All right. If I see nothing else, Mr. Massey, do you have the motion?
Okay, sir.
There was a new motion that referred to project, just for the record for everybody, specifically naming the project as the Chestnut Street Bridge over the Ipswich River, rather than describing the bridge and its relationship to the Park Street intersection. To be clear, there won't be a warrant for this election. You'll sign that warrant, I believe, with this question on it, probably in October for the November election. This is simply to approve the authorization of a letter that you would then sign and send, or we would bring to the Secretary of State's office on Tuesday of next week to have these questions added to the state biennial election ballot.
Mr. Chair, I move to request the Secretary of the Commonwealth place the following debt exclusion questions on the November 5, 2024 state. I'm gonna mess this up. Biennial election ballot in North Reading. 1, shall the town of North Reading be allowed to exempt from the provisions of Proposition 2 1/2, so-called, the amounts required to pay for the bond issued in order to reconstruct the Chestnut Street Bridge over the Ipswich River? And number 2, shall the town of North Reading be allowed to exempt from the provisions of Proposition 2 1/2, so-called, the amounts required to pay for the bond issued in order to purchase a ladder truck for the fire department? and to sign the attached letter.
Second,
Motion by Mr. Massey, second by Mr. O'Leary. Any further discussion? Seeing none, roll call because it's Zoom. Mr. O'Leary,
aye.
Mrs. Gonzalez,
Aye.
Mr. Massey,
Nay?
Mr. Wallner,
Aye.
and the chair is aye. Motion carries. And Mr. Massey, one more motion for this beautiful Friday where the thunderstorm is rolling into North Reading.
Sir, Mr. Chairman, I move to adjourn.
Second,
Motion by Mr. Massey, second by Mr. O'Leary. Any further discussion? Seeing none, Mr. O'Leary,
aye.
Mrs. Gonzalez,
Aye.
Mr. Massey,
Aye.
Mr. Wallner,
Aye.
and the chair is aye. Everybody have a great weekend. Thank you again.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. You too.
Thanks, everybody, for your time on a Friday afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.